All right, guys, we're just coming off one of the best cards of the year. In fact, I think I'm going to go ahead and say it is the best card of the year. It's amazing. I am blown away at how good Volkanovski looked. I am heartbroken for what happened to Whittaker, and I am still shocked that Dan Hooker managed to get a win as well. Let's go over most of the fights, not all of the fights on the card, because they weren't all great. Although if there was going to be a card where they were all great, this would be the one. Let's start straight away with Volkanovski versus Yair. Now, Volkanovski was coming into this as the big favorite. Like, we all knew that Volkanovski was going to win, but after that card, especially after that main event, I was pretty sure that we were all going into it like, geez, the underdogs are looking good here. The people who shouldn't win have been winning. And let's face it, tonight was nearly as bad for Australia as Gallipoli. We nearly got lit up tonight. It could have been a clean wash for all the Aussies tonight. So I was personally thinking that Volkanovski must just be shitting bricks in the back there, guys, knowing that he's the last Aussie to go and walk for what is a terrible night for the Aussies. I don't know if you guys know this, but Dan Hooker, he's technically a Kiwi. He's not an Aussie. So it wasn't a good night for us, especially after what happened for Whittaker. The biggest takeaway from that fight was that it's obvious that the training that Volk put in for Makhachev is something that he's absorbed and he's going to be carrying forward into his next couple of fights. There in round 3, when it was a stand-up affair, Volk wasn't looking as sharp as he usually does. It looked like he was taking a moment to actually get into it and wake up on the feet. But when he did and he landed that punch on Yair that just sort of sent that ending into motion, it was classic Volkanovski. So now we have this new, even more dangerous fighter, as if Volkanovski wasn't dangerous enough. A Volkanovski with a strong ground game as well. And God, I want to see him versus Makhachev in October on Fight Island. The only thing that keeps me a little bit hesitant for that is Volk was saying how he needs to have surgery on his arm. And Volk is such a killer. He says he needs to have surgery on his arm, and at the same time says that he wants to keep fighting this year. Like, dude, you can't do both. It's July. We don't have time for a surgery and another fight this year. But if anyone can pull it off, I think it'll be the little pitbull Volkanovski. As for some of the dumb things that Cormier said this week, I think you've got to put Volk at the top of your featherweight GOAT list. He's now got... Look, just look at, they were slobbering all over Max Holloway's member when he was the champion. And Volkanovski has beaten Holloway alone more times than Holloway has had title defenses. Volkanovski has put in such a good amount of work and absolutely obliterated everyone in front of him, including Aljo, that you sort of have to put him at the top of that GOAT list. And I think that conversation is over. And now the only conversation that is left to be had is, where does Volkanovski stand on the overall pound for pound list? And to me, you've got either John Jones or Alexander Volkanovski. And there's only going to be two camps here, guys. Either you think drug cheating is okay, in which case, obviously, John Jones is the GOAT and will always be the GOAT, or you think drug cheating isn't okay, and therefore it has to be Alexander Volkanovski as the greatest MMA fighter in the world right now. I really don't see any other way that you can break this up. They've both moved up weight classes. I know Volk didn't get the win against Makhachev, but it was razor thin, and Makhachev weighed so much more on fight day than Volkanovski did. And just the level of work that he has put in, to me, he is the number one pound for pound in the world, unless, of course, you want to say it's John Jones, which I completely understand. Like, at this point of the sport, we pretty much have to assume that everyone is on performance-enhancing drugs, and if we do assume that everyone is, then you might as well say John Jones is the greatest fighter of all time. Let's move on, guys, to Brendan Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja. Fuck the crowd, guys. Like, fuck the Vegas crowd booing that fight. That fight was spectacular. That was such a high-level MMA fight. Look, I understand Moreno is clearly a huge crowd favorite, obviously, but that fight was so closely contested. And when I talk about seeing the fight in the fighter, guys, they both had that tonight. They both brought every single bit of fight that they had. It was amazing to watch. It was such a close fight. Now, it was a close fight, even though to me personally, I had round 1, 3, 4, and 5 all going to Pantoja, and Moreno only winning round 2. But Pantoja won all those rounds by the slimmest of margins, except for round 5. He clearly won round 5 to me. But those middle rounds, he won them by the slimmest of margins. So I can understand how the Moreno fans would be salty and upset about it. It was a close fight. It was a competitive fight. It was well fought. But at the end of the day, like, Moreno just didn't do enough to win. Moreno is still young enough and still popular enough that I think he should hang around, stay in that top 5, see if he can contend for the belt one more time. He's probably still on a great contract with the UFC, guys. Like, let's be honest. There's no reason to retire yet. And Pantoja, we're in the new era. You know, all I want to see is an active champion. And if he is an active champion, then that's good enough for me. I'm going to be cheering for him going forward. With the level of skill that these two show in that fight, I feel like every time Moreno fights, all I'm talking about is the level of MMA that we're seeing. It's an incredible weight class to watch. The only bit of concern that I have coming out of that fight, guys, was this bullshit blatant favoritism from the UFC as they're trying to push into the Mexican market. Moreno had round 5 on the judges' scorecards, which is pretty much one of the clearest rounds in that fight that he clearly didn't win. And this happened a couple of times of the night, you know, going into the judges' scorecards, where I was like, going into the Volkanovski fight, I'm like, well, they're setting up for a robbery here. There is an incoming robbery, because we see that on some fight nights, don't we? Early on in the card, you have some questionable decisions, and then you get to that, you know, Kai Kara France main event, and all of a sudden there's this questionable scorecard and everyone just sort of moves on from it. It's as I predicted, was one of the things that was going to happen in the Whittaker fight. So I was a bit worried that because it didn't happen in the Whittaker fight, it was going to happen in the Volkanovski fight. Luckily, it didn't. I was jumping on my chair watching this fight. It was one of those fights where it was just back and forth, bloody, amazing to watch. Fire the judges. I don't know what they were watching. Round 5 was easy to score, and yet again, the judges got it wrong. So luckily, to me, the right man won in the end. Good on him. The Vegas crowd, why boo that? Why boo? Out of all the fights in the world to boo, guys, why boo that one? Okay, now we get into the dark part of the card. And I mean that on a number of levels. Like, really, guys, the Dricus Du Plessis versus Robert Whittaker. Number one, it was a great fight while it lasted. Whittaker looked sharp on the feet, but new mythical fighter incoming, Dricus Du Plessis, the man who can breathe, put it on Robert Whittaker, crumbled him, like emotionally crumbled him, and ended Robert. It's very weird to see Robbie cowering up like that with his hands over his face, just eating shots. It wasn't an early stoppage. I completely understand the stoppage. And just great on Dricus. Like, Dricus just brought it to Robbie. And Robbie looked like classic Robbie in that first round. You know, he was keeping distance, landing good strikes. And then the end of the first round, like, Dricus just turned it on and he didn't give up. And Dricus seems to have this steamroller mentality where he knows he'll be going straight for the title. Like, since he has entered the UFC, that has been his goal, and he has been going for that goal 100% and just like cutting a path through everyone that stands in his way. And unfortunately, my heart tonight was standing in his way. When Robert Whittaker lost, I was almost in tears. And so that was already a fairly dark part of the card. But then the card just seemed to get worse and worse. They panned over to Israel Adesanya. Izzy said that he wanted to go into the cage. This moment is going to go down as a viral moment in UFC history. Izzy goes into the cage, and in the middle of Dricus Du Plessis trying to be very respectful and say thank you to Robert Whittaker and just appreciate the run that he's been on, and now there is this huge changing of the guard, we start to set up the next fight. And Israel Adesanya just starts racially abusing Dricus Du Plessis, and Du Plessis is just like, what the fuck is going on? Like, I've got to say something. It was so uncomfortable. It's sad that Izzy has to like bring it down to this level. It's going to be such a messy fight week going into their pay-per-view fight. For the UFC as a whole, as a company, it's going to bring a lot of attention to it, but the narrative that's going to get drawn out of this is just going to be an ugly one to watch. It's going to be really, really ugly. I've already seen that Daniel Cormier, Joe Rogan, they're already running cover for Izzy and saying that he was probably drunk and when he went into the cage and said those things. But to me, that's worse. Like, we've canceled people for less than, you know, being on TV, getting drunk and throwing racial slurs around. And now, like, if you just look at Izzy's last 2 fights, he's got the dog collar, the dress, he's abused children. Now he's done that to Dricus Du Plessis, and he's sort of stolen the moment of this changing of the guard. Like, finally, we have a new contender in that weight division. It was odd and cringy, and I don't know how many fans Izzy had before that, but I think his fan count is going to be going down and down with every single pay-per-view card that he's on, which, on the flip side, that's a problem for the UFC, because Israel Adesanya is a massive name for the UFC, and he has just been getting weirder and weirder over the last few pay-per-views. Really, really sad to see. But let's pick up the mood a bit. Daniel Hooker versus Jalin Turner. Now, I thought Jalin Turner was going to win. I think we all thought Jalin Turner was going to win. This is going to be such an interesting card for us all to watch back and really digest this week, because it seemed like the whole MMA community for once was on point and all agreeing with each other going into UFC 290, and things just got completely thrown on their heads. So it just goes to show, from the YouTube casuals to the MMA experts, one of the greatest things about this sport is you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen when that cage door closes. And Dan Hooker showed that to us tonight, boys. Dan Hooker opened up the fight with one of my favorite moves, a good old kick to the balls. Unfortunately, it is an illegal move, no matter how effective that it is. And then I started to give the rest of that first, and Dan Hooker just came back and turned it on in the second round and kept on him. He went full Super Saiyan. He channeled his real Charles Oliveira and went on to just beat the living piss out of Jalin Turner and made Jalin Turner give up. Like, you could see him slowly crumbling during that fight and realize that he wasn't going to win this. He was covering up. Dan Hooker was attacking the body. He was covering the body. Dan Hooker was attacking the head. It was an absolute savaging from Dan Hooker. And once again, we've got to look at the judges' scorecards in round 3. That was clearly a Dan Hooker round, but why do we have these pre-written scorecards? Like, are we turning into boxing? Is there clearly an agenda in UFC where we're writing scorecards that are just insane? I don't know how we're going to fix the scoring. They're obviously doing it on purpose, but Adelaide Bird gave round 3 to Jalin Turner. There's only one way to fix it. Fire Adelaide Bird. You have to start firing these judges that are making these disgusting scorecards. What's next for those two fighters? I mean, what's next for Jalin Turner? He missed weight in the top 10 of the lightweight division. The lightweight division is the UFC's most important division. He's in the top 10. He's missing weight. To me, that's unacceptable. You need to move up a weight class. You cannot be missing weight in that division. Imagine if he was fighting up the rankings against Michael Chandler or Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje. He's going into those huge title fight events where if you lose a fight, it sets your career back 2 years, and he's going into it with a 2-pound weight advantage, or he doesn't make weight, and then Michael Chandler or Dustin Poirier chooses not to take the fight. They're the kind of fights that are either pay-per-view main events or the feature fight of a pay-per-view, and we can't be risking weight cutting issues on those sort of places in such big cards. I mean, they carried the last card. Charles Oliveira carried the last card. Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje are carrying the next card. The top 10 of the lightweight division is the most important division in all of MMA. So if you're going to be there, then you need to be making weight. And Jalin, if you miss a weight cut one more time, you cannot be there. You can't be staying in that division. As for Dan Hooker, he's back on Murderer's Row. He's back on Murderer's Row, isn't he? So he fought someone that was a little bit rangier than him, a little bit bigger than him. I'm really interested to hear, what do we do next for Daniel Hooker? My brain is saying Rafael Fiziev. Why not? Let's see what's going to happen between those two. I'm sure there's other matchups to be made. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. It's one of those fun ones where okay, he's back now. He's back. We can start putting together some good fights for him. So please let me know down in the comments What do you want to see next with Daniel Hooker? Bo Nickal versus Some Guy. Bo Nickal was a massive favorite. It was Some Guy's first week in the UFC. He shouldn't have been on a pay-per-view. Bo Nickal just needed a punching bag. And Bo Nickal gave him the punching bag experience. He smashed him in the first round. I thought there would have been more wrestling out of Bo Nickal. Bo Nickal is one of those guys where if you are an American fanboy of the USA wrestling, then you are a Bo Nickal fanboy, and I get that. As a MMA fan from Australia, I don't really care about Bo Nickal. He hasn't been in the UFC that much for me to watch him. And if I'm going to get excited about his wrestling, then let's test his wrestling. Like, you want me to be excited? I want to see him against a Dagestani wrestler. I want to see him against Albert Duraev on Fight Island in Abu Dhabi in October. Test Bo Nickal in front of me rather than giving him literally no-name fighters, and I will get on the Bo Nickal hype train. But right now, all I'm seeing is these adverts telling me that I should be hyped for Bo Nickal, and I'm not seeing him tested. So it's not his fault. It's not his fault. But so far in the UFC, he's had one victory via nutshot and one victory via some guy who shouldn't even be in the UFC. It's a hard hype train to get on board just yet. So I'm very happy for the American wrestlers. You've got a guy, but can we put some flavor on him, please? Can we do something with this? Give us a Dagestani on Fight Island. I'll be cheering for him. I'll see if he can pass the test. If he can pass the test, there we go. Now we got something to talk about. Robbie Lawler versus Niko Price. He walked into the cage after going through the fighter checks, and it was so good to see him just stop and take that moment, knowing that it was going to be his last fight. And then with that flash first round knockout, it was brilliant to see. Then they played that amazing tribute to him with, he was standing there in the middle of the cage with Joe Rogan playing that tribute. They kept cutting back to him and he was in tears. And after 20 years of being in the UFC, to see someone that has been such a crowd favorite and given us so much for so long actually get a good send-off. Guys, we don't get good send-offs in this sport. You know, like when you have been a stud in the UFC, you get fed to new blood, so the new blood has your name underneath them. So they have your head on the mantelpiece. And that's happened to Robbie, and he's stuck around for that part of his UFC career, all the way up to this point where we've gotten all the name value we can out of you. Now the fans just appreciate you. Why don't you headline the prelims and we'll play you this epic montage on the way out of the octagon, keep the camera on you while you're signing fans' gloves. It was amazing. We don't see retirements like that. We don't see them. So to finally have a moment like that, all I can say is thank you, Robbie Lawler. Thank you. And thank you, UFC. You did something great in that moment. It was one of the reasons that made this the best pay-per-view that I can remember in a long time. Knockouts, emotional exits, unexpected wins. Like, this was one of those pay-per-views where it had it all. We're going to be talking about UFC 290 for a long, long time, and Robbie Lawler was an essential part of that. Amazing work. Another thing that goes the UFC's way. Lucky that Robbie Lawler got a first round finish and that the UFC had time to play that promo before the pay-per-view started. Very lucky. But either way, good on Robbie Lawler. That was an awesome show. Thank you so much. And guys, the rest of the card before that, full of exciting stoppages. Crute, Manifield, Jimmy Crute. I am not going to be surprised if you end up retiring after this. Your stand-up was sloppy. Your ground game was sloppy. You took off the gloves after that. Like, you knew that something wasn't right in that fight. I don't know if we're at a real turning point moment for Jimmy Crute where he's realizing where he actually is in this game. I mean, great work from Manifield. Really, really great work. And Jimmy Crute losing like that, it was just part of Australia's destruction tonight. Like, absolute destruction. Again, if Volk didn't win that, this would have been a very different video, guys. A very different video. It might have just been me crying into the camera for half an hour. Let's talk about Tatsu Taira versus Edgar Chairez. The one thing that I do want to bring up about this one, guys, is Tatsu Taira. He is on an undefeated streak in the UFC, but as we're looking forward on our predictions and really thinking about him, let's just take a moment and remember, or maybe go back and watch how his stand-up game was, because it was a bit shit, wasn't it? Like, he's a bit open on the feet. So if he's up against a great boxer moving forward, I don't know if we can sort of guarantee a win here or even should put him in the win column here. For someone who was such a big favorite, I actually would have liked to have seen a bit more of a dominating performance out of him rather than the performance that we did get out of him. And the last one that I wanted to cover, Jesus Aguilera against Shannon Ross. Jesus, you beat the piss out of Shannon Ross. Well, maybe beat the piss isn't the right way to put it, because you didn't get that many fists on him. You just landed one brilliant knockout that bounced Shannon's head off the canvas. And that's sort of when I knew that the Aussies were off to a shaky start this morning. I think for me and my time, it might have been 8:30, 9 a.m. this morning. I was excited to see the first Aussie on the card, and then Jesus just blacked him out. I was like, oh no, oh, it's going to be a long night. And it was, but it was fun to watch. Guys, let me know your thoughts on UFC 290 down in the comments. There's a couple of things that I am very interested in moving forward from this. Number one, what are we going to do with Robert Whittaker now that he started to go on his skid? I mean, he's just lost one fight. Saying Robert Whittaker is going on his skid is a bit harsh, but it's rare to see Robbie lose. He's only ever lost to Israel Adesanya in like the last 10 years or something like that. So to have him lose in a contendership fight, it sort of does start to indicate, is this the end of Robbie's career? Do you want to see him go against Sean Strickland next, or do you want Sean Strickland to be a little bit protected like Sean O'Malley is? I personally don't think they're going to do Sean Strickland any favors. I think that's the next fight to make. What did you think of Israel Adesanya's performance in the cage tonight after that moment? Was it too cringy for you, or what are your thoughts on that? To me, that was a step too far. And what are we going to do with Volkanovski next? Is it Ilia Topuria, or do we give Volkanovski straight away to Makhachev, even though he says he needs some surgery done on his hand? Volkanovski is not the kind of guy that wants to sit out for a bit. There is so many good questions and so many great conversations that come out of an amazing card like this. And it's insane to think that in 3 weeks' time, we're going to be doing this all again at UFC 291. One of the best cards of the year. I want to hear your thoughts down in the comments, guys. I'll see you all in the next video.